Deep in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico,
It's around the sun.
And the Chaco didn't have modern calendars all those centuries ago. Instead, they set up their buildings to interact with the sun. When sunlight shone through a certain window, they'd know it was time to plant, time to harvest, or time for a solstice.
The buildings themselves and how they're laid out within the canyon, it's almost like they were creating a calendar on the landscape.
canyon sits mostly silent. The wind moves through it, ravens circle overhead, and the ruins of enormous stone buildings cast long shadows across the canyon floor. This place is called Chaco Canyon, and roughly 1,000 years ago, it was the beating heart of one of the most sophisticated civilizations ever to exist in North America. Then the people left, and nobody fully agrees on why. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly who built Chaco Canyon, what made it so extraordinary.
Go on for quite a ways. Remember, there were over 600 rooms in this complex, so this is just a small fraction of what used to be. Many original Vigo remains are still in the walls, showing where these ceilings between the floors were,
and why its abandonment remains one of archaeology's most argued questions. The people who built Chaco Canyon are known today as the Ancestral Puebloans. For a long time, they were called the Anasazi, but many native communities consider that name inaccurate, so scholars shifted to Ancestral Puebloans.
Directions that have a special connection with the sun. As the morning sun arcs over the building, the shadow of the midwall recedes, until just at noon, when it disappears.
Their descendants include the Pueblo people still living across New Mexico and Arizona today. These are not a vanished race. They are the ancestors of real communities with living cultures, ongoing traditions, and a deep connection to the land their grandparents.
Chaco Canyon is just an ancient civilization. Now it's a site in the American Southwest.
It's a pretty fascinating society. It was one of the most sophisticated in North America. To construct these buildings, they moved 200,000 logs, approximately 50 miles.
It's not easy to move 200,000 timbers, no draft animals, no wheel, no method of modern carriage could have been used at the time.
Grandparents shaped with their own hands. The Ancestral Puebloans began settling the Chaco Canyon area long before the Great Building Era started. But around 900 AD, something shifted. Construction began on a scale that nobody in this region had ever attempted. Over the next 200 years, between 900 and 1100 AD, the people of Chaco built what archaeologists call great houses. These were not simple shelters. They were massive, multi-story stone structures, some containing hundreds of rooms, built with a level of planning and coordination that still draws researchers from around the world. Pueblo Bonito is the most famous of these great houses. It rises several stories at its peak, curves in a D shape that faces south and contains room after room after room. Researchers have spent decades mapping it, measuring it, and trying to understand what all those rooms were used for. The building did not just grow randomly. It was designed. Someone, or more likely a coordinated group of people, planned this structure before they laid the first stone. And they were not just building shelter. They were building in conversation with the sky. The astronomical alignment of Chaco's great houses is one of the site's most discussed and studied features. Structures across the canyon align with solar and lunar events, including solstices and equinoxes, with an accuracy that tells you these builders were watching the sky carefully over many generations. They track the movement of the sun and moon across the horizon. They built walls and doorways that catch the light at specific moments of the year, marking time in stone. Archaeologist Dr. Stephen Lexon, who has studied Chaco extensively, put it plainly when he said that Chaco Canyon wasn't just a place. It was the heart of a civilization.
Year ban on oil and gas development surrounding Chaco Canyon. The Bureau of Land Management made the announcement in a letter sent to tribal leaders last Thursday. The site has been at the center of a fight over fracking for years, spanning multiple presidential administrations. But in 2023, former President Joe Biden issued an order to ban oil and gas development for 2 decades within 10 miles of the historic site in northwestern New Mexico.
That civilization was also deeply connected to communities far beyond the canyon walls. A system of roads extended outward from Chaco, linking it to more than 70 outlying villages. These were not rough trails. They were engineered roads, straight and wide, cut across the desert with intention. Moving along these roads, goods traveled in and out of Chaco in a trade network that reached as far as what is now Mexico. Researchers have found pottery inside Chaco's great houses that doesn't match local styles at all, instead reflecting influences from distant cultures to the south. Shells, copper bells, and macaw feathers have also been found at the site, pointing to exchange networks that crossed enormous distances. Chaco was not a remote village. It was a regional center, and it pulled people in. At its peak around 1100 AD, Chaco functioned as a ceremonial hub, a gathering place where communities came together for events tied to the cycles of the sky, the agricultural calendar, and social bonds between communities spread across hundreds of miles. The central plazas inside the great houses served as gathering points for ceremonies and community events. The scale of construction and coordination required to build and maintain all of this tells you that Chaco had real organizational power, a way of bringing people together around shared beliefs and shared work. The Chaco Culture National Historical Park today covers more than 33,000 acres of protected land. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, a recognition of its global cultural importance. Since the park opened to the public, approximately 7 million people have visited the canyon. Excavations across the site have turned up more than 200,000 artifacts, including pottery, tools, and architectural remnants, each one a small piece of the larger story of who these people were and how they lived. But here is where the story takes a turn that no artifact can fully explain. Around 1150 AD, the great era of Chaco began to unwind. Construction slowed. The population began to shift. And over the following century, the canyon's role as a regional center faded. By 1250 AD, Chaco was largely emptied out. The final abandonment came by 1300 AD, when the last residents moved on to other regions. The great houses stood empty. The roads went quiet. The question that has fueled debate among archaeologists ever since is simple to ask and hard to answer. Why? The most widely discussed explanation centers on climate. Tree ring data from the region shows that the American Southwest experienced serious drought conditions during the late 1100s. Agriculture in a high desert environment is always a gamble, and a prolonged drought would have put enormous pressure on a population that depended on reliable harvests to feed a regional center of this size. When the rains failed, the food system would have strained, then broken. People would have had to move to find water and arable land. But drought alone doesn't satisfy everyone. Some researchers point to resource depletion as a compounding factor. Building hundreds of rooms and ceremonial structures across a canyon requires timber, and a lot of it. Surveys of the surrounding landscape suggest that the forests near Chaco were heavily logged over centuries of construction. By the time the population peaked, the people may have already stripped the nearby land of the trees they needed for building and for fuel. That kind of depletion does not bounce back quickly. And then there is the social dimension. Some researchers argue that the organizational system holding Chaco together, the ceremonies, the trade networks, the hierarchies that coordinated all that construction, may have lost its authority. When communities stopped coming to Chaco, when the roads carried fewer goods and fewer people, the center may have lost the practical and symbolic role that made it worth staying in. The mainstream view leans heavily on drought and ecology, but the social and political factors are harder to measure and are not something researchers have set aside. What is clear is that the people did not vanish. That word vanish gets used carelessly when people talk about ancient civilizations, and it misleads. The Ancestral Puebloans moved. They relocated to areas with more reliable water, joining or forming communities across the Rio Grande Valley and other parts of the Southwest. Their descendants built the pueblos that Spanish explorers encountered centuries later. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona today carry that ancestry, that knowledge, and that spiritual connection to Chaco Canyon forward into the present. For those communities, Chaco is not a historical mystery to be solved from the outside. It is a sacred place tied to their identity and their past. That connection is central to a debate that is very much alive right now. Chaco Canyon sits in a region that also holds significant oil and gas deposits. For years, energy development has pushed closer to the park's boundaries, and tribal communities and preservationists have pushed back hard. As of 2023, legislative discussions around the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act have focused on restricting oil and gas drilling in the areas surrounding the canyon. Supporters of the legislation argue that industrial activity in the region threatens not just the physical site, but the spiritual and cultural landscape that the Pueblo peoples have maintained a relationship with for centuries. The National Park Service manages Chaco Culture National Historical Park and works to balance access, research, and protection. But the larger fight over what happens to the land surrounding the park is one that lawmakers, tribal nations, and energy interests are still working through. Chaco Canyon sits in a canyon in the high desert, exposed to wind and weather, far from major highways. Getting there requires driving miles of dirt road. And yet 7 million people have made that trip. Researchers keep returning to study it. Tribal communities fight to protect it. Documentary filmmakers keep coming back to it. PBS aired a film about its astronomical mysteries more than 10,000 times across 95% of its stations. That kind of sustained attention does not happen by accident. There is something about this place that refuses to let go. Maybe it is the scale of what was built. Standing inside Pueblo Bonito, surrounded by walls that have been standing for over 1,000 years, it is hard not to feel the weight of the effort those walls represent. The planning, the labor, the belief system powerful enough to organize hundreds of people across hundreds of miles around a shared vision. Maybe it is the precision of the astronomical alignments. The idea that people in 900 AD were watching the sky with enough care and enough patience to encode the movements of the sun and moon into the walls of their buildings. Or maybe it is the question that still hangs in the dry desert air. A civilization built something extraordinary here. They sustained it for 250 years. And then they walked away. The ruins they left behind are filled with artifacts, with architecture, with astronomical alignments, and with silence. 200,000 artifacts have been pulled from this canyon, and researchers are still piecing together what they mean. Chaco Canyon is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not just because it is old and impressive, but because it represents a kind of human achievement that is genuinely hard to explain. A group of people with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no written records that have survived, built a regional civilization in one of the most demanding environments in North America. They tracked the stars. They built roads. They maintained trade networks stretching across the continent. They gathered communities together at a place that still draws people in today. And then they left. The debate over why continues. The protection of what remains continues. The connection between the Pueblo peoples and this canyon continues. Chaco Canyon is not a closed chapter. It is an open question written in stone, waiting in the high desert for anyone willing to make the drive down that dirt road and stand inside those walls and ask what happened here.